Welcome to Afternoon Briefing this Wednesday. Greg Jennet with you from our Parliament House studio here in Canberra on Ngunnawal country. Well, Parliament's in the process now of passing last night's 22-2023 budget into law, all $600 billion worth of taxes and spending. It's passing without incident for the Morrison government because the package is winning bipartisan support from Labor. That doesn't mean it gets through without scrutiny or criticism, though, so we'll look at some of the outstanding questions and quibbles today on Afternoon Briefing. Locked and loaded, Parliament on the brink of giving the tick to Josh Frydenberg's fourth budget. Under the pump once more, rain lashes northern New South Wales midway through the clean-up from last floods. And awake for Warne, Australia prepares to honour the larrikin spin king. Well, the 46th Parliament isn't quite done yet, but it's awfully close now to finishing its business. The only obstacle Scott Morrison had to clear before calling the May election is all but cleared, with the passage of the budget and its associated bills almost complete now. The House is due to sit tomorrow, but not the Senate. That means the 151 members in it, or at least those who are present here this week, are a little over 24 hours away from leaving Canberra, not to return unless they're re-elected in May. This and the fact that we've barely had a full House for 2 years gave Speaker Andrew Wallace the cue to arrange the official photo on the penultimate day. Yeah, and the operation to sell the budget will soon be 24 hours old itself. Most questions that Josh Frydenberg's faced today have dealt with the cost of living relief that forms its centrepiece. Yet it's remarkable how often the Treasurer and the Prime Minister have also spoken about the Labor opposition and its leader Anthony Albanese, while trying to embellish the coalition's own economic management credentials.
In just a few weeks' time, our nation goes to the polls. Voters will face a clear choice: a Liberal national coalition led by Scott Morrison that has delivered a world-leading economic recovery and now has outlined its long-term plan to create more jobs. And a Labor Party led by Anthony Albanese that has largely hidden from view for the last 3 years, trying to sneak into government with little more than a false and fanciful promise that he would govern like Bob Hawke and John Howard. The opposite would be true. The most left-wing Labor leader since Gough Whitlam, who has spent his entire political career championing higher taxes and higher spending. It's a history the Leader of the Opposition wants to conveniently forget.
Now, Anthony Albanese was consistent before Budget Day and consistent the day after it too, that this wasn't really a budget at all, he insisted, merely a platform for the Prime Minister to launch his campaign for re-election. That's the theme that he returned to as early as his first media interviews this morning.
Real wages will decrease by $1,355 this year, and these one-off payments that will just disappear as soon as the election is gone. I think Australians will see through this. This has all the sincerity of a fake tan, and it will disappear just as quickly.
But just on the fuel excise cut, something like that, for example, is a one-off move for 6 months. Do you agree that that is the right policy decision now?
Look, we agree with any measure that takes pressure off families.
So that includes one-off payments?
It includes that, and we won't stand in the way of it. But the problem is this government doesn't have any plans beyond getting itself through an election. And that's why this government is characterised by just looking after itself, not looking after the long-term interests of the Australian people.
All right, well, he joined us yesterday and we're glad to say he's joining us again 24 hours later. Finance Minister Simon Birmingham is here in the studio with us, only this time unbound by any requirement, Senator, to keep surprises under wraps. So why don't we run through what was lobbed out last night, starting with the cost of living relief and the fuel excise. Why can motorists be certain that they will notice a difference at the pump in, what are you saying, a week to 2 weeks' time?
So, Greg, we're putting the legislation through the Parliament today and within 24 hours of the budget, making sure that that 22 cent per litre reduction in the fuel excise comes into law. That means it's around $15 per tank of fuel when people go out and fill their cars up. We have given instructions to the ACCC around using every inch of their monitoring powers and their penalties if anybody does the wrong thing. The ACCC has extensive experience in looking into the fuel industry, into petrol pricing. We're quite confident that they have the skills to identify if anybody does anything wrong and to hold them to account.
It's complicated though, isn't it? Because world oil prices are gyrating at the moment. I think they went up a few percentage points in the last 24 hours, but they'd fallen 3 or 4% the couple of days before that. So can we be certain that if it's entering an upward cycle, people can be sure that the full 22 cents was actually passed on and wasn't disguised by those natural fluctuations?
That's why we've asked the experts of the ACCC to do this work, because they have the experience in understanding how the different pressure points across the petrol supply chain actually works, where of course oil price movements relate then through the distribution channels and ultimately to retail pricing. It will take a week or two to flow through to the Bowser, but Australians will see fuel 22 cents a litre less than it would have otherwise been. We're doing this because we can't control those global oil price movements. They've spiked as a result of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. They continue to show great volatility. We and international markets expect there will be a stabilisation back at least somewhat more normal levels than some of these spikes into the future. It's why this is a measure that is temporary and targeted to deal with a temporary spike and a temporary problem that's come from the other side of the world but is hurting Australian families and motorists right now.
Yeah, it is temporary and it's defined with an end date in the legislation. In the preparation of this, because we know what government policymaking can do to distort markets, as you prepared this, did you take a look at all about distortionary behavioural changes towards the tail end of this? I know people can't store vast amounts of fuel around their home or their garage, but have you given thought to how that might look as we reach the end date of this scheme?
There may be very minor behavioural impacts that occur, but ultimately this is about addressing real-life problems that real-life Australians have right now as a result of events well outside of their control, outside of our control, happening from the other side of the world. But what we can control is this rate of taxation. Ultimately, it's necessary for investment in roads and infrastructure. We can't permanently undermine a revenue base, but we can provide this cost of living relief knowing these spikes won't be there forever, and we want to make sure that Australians get through this time without feeling too much pain.
Yep, and with the other sort of cash benefits, the low to middle income tax offset bonus and the $250 for pensioners and concession card holders, that again you can guarantee will not be extended. This is literally a one-off, because I know many people are starting to look now at the disappearance of the Lamington, so-called, and are facing the prospect of higher taxes at that point.
Well, these are absolutely one-off payments that we're introducing because of unique circumstances driven from events around the world, but they're impacting on Australians. So we're doing the fuel price cut, benefiting all motorists, be they, of course, people doing the run to work, the run to school, operating in terms of their small business or other activities. We're also applying these payments to help low and middle and fixed income Australians and to give them extra support. But what I'd highlight more generally is, as a government, we've shown the willingness to act when necessary in targeted ways and to adapt policy as necessary. So during COVID-19, we introduced a range of things in terms of additional payments, support, and of course the JobKeeper program. Yeah. All of those extraordinary measures were in response to events to help Australians given a crisis at that particular point in time. And we made sure we showed the policy innovation, but we also kept them temporary and targeted, avoiding the type of legacy of budget blowouts that Labor had in their years when they did school halls and pink bats and cash for clunkers and other disastrous policies. Our interventions have been shown to help Australians when it matters, at the time it matters. And of course, if re-elected, we'll show that type of innovative approach if we face further crises in the future.
Right, but Lamington would not be extended under any circumstances. Are you prepared to say that? That's
no. So I mean, the low middle income tax offset was extended as part of those COVID supports.
Yep.
Otherwise, its role in our income tax reforms, which are extensive and which ensure when the final piece of them come in the next parliament, which we've already legislated, and Australians can rely on us to keep that promise. Whether they can rely on Labor to keep a promise that they never liked and they've only grudgingly come to accept is questionable.
Well, there's no suggestion.
It will ensure, those reforms will ensure that 90% of Australians pay no more than 30 cents in the dollar as their top marginal tax rate. It's a significant reform to income tax, and it creates more incentive to work the extra shift, to take the extra part-time job, and ultimately to keep more of your take-home pay and have higher disposable income.
Sure, there's no suggestion we have on the table yet. We are going to talk
only Labor's track record
about Labor and the next wave of personal income tax cuts. Structural deficit, though, even as we wash out some of the temporary measures, spending still remains higher than revenue as far as the eye can see, 10 years. Can we expect a pledge at some point to close that in year 11 or year 12? When are Australian governments of all persuasions, but particularly your own, the coalition, likely to be able to bridge that gap?
Well, we've bridged the gap a lot in last night's budget. Indeed, the deficit as a share of the size of the economy has around halved compared to what it was previously. So we have demonstrated that our fiscal strategy of growing the economy more strongly is helping to bridge that gap. And of course, that's the strategy we're continuing forward with an economic plan for the future that will seek to drive further strength in economic growth.
There are no caps on the spending side, though, are there? That's how you could drive that change more ruthlessly.
We remain committed to, for example, meeting the full costs of the National Disability Insurance Scheme, to meeting the costs of our aged care reform, to meeting costs in defence expenditure. These are all areas of real pressure that we face in terms of the budget. But what we demonstrated in last night's budget was that the rate of payment by government has actually been coming down by around 6% this year compared to last year, by close to 5% next year compared to this year. These are the largest reductions in payments by governments in close to 50 years. It's a demonstration of the fact that when we said COVID support would be temporary and targeted, we meant it, we've acted on that. We are closing that gap, and the strength of our economic growth is meaning that the dividends of having fewer people on welfare, more people in jobs and contributing and paying taxes is helping us to close the deficit, which will now be, as I said, $100 billion less over the budget forward estimates period than we'd previously forecast, thanks to that growth.
Yeah, and let's just hope we don't hit other unforeseen catastrophes globally or in Australia. Simon Birmingham, we'll wrap up this chat for now and talk again before too long.
Thanks, Greg.
Thanks for joining us. Okay, now there are about $11 billion worth of major regional infrastructure projects embedded in the government's budget plan. One of the largest is the Hells Gate Dam on the Burdekin in North Queensland. Bob Katter has been the champion of this $5 billion project for years, but the one that's being promised isn't the one he exactly wanted, mainly because the member for Kennedy believes its wall is too small. So we spoke to the man who's now and set to remain Father of the House a little earlier. Well, Bob Katter, welcome to our afternoon briefing studio. I think the first time this year. Why don't we start with the budget? Bit of an overview as you look at it through the political lens. What did you see last night?
I have been in Parliament for more budgets than anyone else in Australian history, bar one person. So I've seen a lot of them. It was just the normal thing. We'll take some money off some people over here, might be our grandchildren, and we'll buy some votes with the money over here.
Heavily political.
I mean, I don't think there was any real benefit for the Australian people. And I don't like saying that because I like and respect both the Prime Minister and the Treasurer.
it makes good on some commitments that were clearly made to the Nationals in the context of the Glasgow Climate Change Summit, particularly around infrastructure, and in your neck of the woods, the Hell's Gate Dam is a major jewel in the crown in this infrastructure platform that they're building. But you remain deeply unhappy with what they're funding. What's wrong with Hell's Gate in its current form?
You know, it amazes me that as an obscure backbencher that you really can exercise enormous power. If I had known how much power I would have if I'd got out in the backbench, I'd have got out a lot sooner.
Power that you exercised to get the project on the agenda?
No, because you can savage the government when they have made colossal mistakes. And I've described this as the worst planning mistake in Australian history if it goes ahead. Bradfield irrigates, changes from drought and fire and flood ravaged wilderness, not wilderness, because it's becoming invasive species. All of the native flora and fauna are going from that fifth of Australia. It becomes a wonderland. To quote the great Dr. Bradfield, Gurrawina, a land of flowers. It's an Aboriginal word, a land of flowers. Well, he's destroyed that. If you build that dam to 320, you can never get the water out there.
Okay, so you're saying it's in the wrong place, it's too low. You've taken this to the government. What's their explanation?
Excuse my crude expression. It's a pissant little farming dam, right? That's what it is. It's got 50 or 60 farms that'll create. To put that in perspective, the neighbouring towns of Ayr and Ingham have nearly 2,000 farms.
Right.
What's 50 farms? And you can spend 5,000 million. The proposal is 1,000 million to produce for Australia $4,000 million a year in no CO2 emission electricity, feed nearly 1 million head of cattle perpetually, or pigs or chooks, and it'll probably be chooks, and it will provide 7% of Australia's fuel needs, renewables forever, zero CO2. Right. I mean, we've traded 4,000 million for a little petty $200 million worth of farms.
Okay, so you have power by your own admission. You can savage the government. You might even, who knows, have even more power beyond this election. What are you going to do with it? What change are you demanding on Hell's Gate?
The greatest engineers in Australian history have continuously put the height of that dam 395, so the water can gravitate out onto the inland plains, right? Right across Queensland, right across almost the territory border, right? Now, if it's built that way, it is the most wonderful thing for Australia. No more fires, floods, droughts. That's all over.
Are you done with your own negotiating at a federal level over dollars?
No, I hope that the Prime Minister has said that I'll have a look at the thing again. It was a fairly frank discussions yesterday.
And as a statement of principle, if we can look beyond the election, were you to be in balance of power, what are your core demands that you would place on either side? What filter are you going to look at that equation through?
If you don't think you are under threat from China, you are a fool. You are a fool. They are negotiating with Solomon Islands and numerous other parts of the South Pacific. They have Darwin. Just think of the strategy of this. Halfway to Perth, there is the Ord. They own half the Ord, was given to them by this government. Mm-hmm. And they own the Meriden Air Base outside of Perth. Now, air base, Constellations can come in and bring almost a battalion of troops in anytime China wants to bring them in, because there's no way of stopping them. Now, I would immediately move to providing a rifle for every single boy and girl too, if they want them, in an armoury in every single school in Australia. And if that sounds extremist, that's what Israel does. That's what Finland does. That's what Sweden does.
But
that's what Switzerland does.
What would you call compulsory service?
No. All I'm saying is give them a rifle, right? Now, you know, a missile fortress wall, but most important of all, to have a secure fuel supply. And I can tell you, if I have that balance of power, you will ban the export of oil. and you will produce the fuel here in Australia. You will introduce ethanol and algae, alternative fuels immediately, and this country will be self-sufficient in fuel. You will kick China out of the 42% of the electricity industry of Australia that they own. They're out, and every other foreign power is out too. Electricity will be owned by Australians. So, I mean, secure your essential services, electricity and fuel, and then a missile barrier around Australia.
Well, Anthony Albanese and Scott Morrison, take note. Notice has been served if we ever find ourselves...
We're on 20%. Yeah. You know, little blokes like me are on 20%.
And here's the assurance I'll give you, Bob. If you happen to be in balance of power, we'll be talking to you straight off the bat, and you can...
We look forward to it very much.
Put your log of claims in. Thanks for joining us.
We look forward to it very much.
Well, it wasn't only Josh Frydenberg who eagerly strayed from defence of his own budget into spirited attack on Anthony Albanese and his shadow treasurer Jim Chalmers. Scott Morrison also got in on that action at question time, seeking to make a point about experience in pulling budgets together.
To those opposite who would be responsible for the economic management of this country, a leader of the opposition who's never delivered a budget.
Member for Griffith.
Spent 6 weeks
Member
on
for
the
Griffith.
expenditure review committee and never delivered a budget, Mr Speaker. The Shadow Treasurer has also never delivered a budget. On this side, Mr Speaker, a Treasurer has delivered 4 budgets. A Prime Minister has delivered 3 budgets as a Treasurer, 4 budgets as a Prime Minister and 1 budget as a member of the Expenditure Review Committee. That's
Order.
8. That's
Order.
8, Mr Speaker. So I'll put my 8 budgets up to your 0 every single time, because 0 is the amount of policy we've seen from those opposite. Mr Speaker, we often speak of net zero in this place. Well, the Labor Party is net zero on policy.
All right, we've already heard from Simon Birmingham this afternoon, and as promised, his opposite number, Shadow Finance Minister Katy Gallagher, joins us now. Welcome, Senator. As we note there with Scott Morrison, some of the budget sales pitch has actually turned to economic management credentials and numbers of budgets delivered. How's Labor going to be responding to that? The government seems to believe, if its behaviour today is anything to go by, that it's on firm ground prosecuting this argument.
Well, I think it was a very angry and defensive Prime Minister in that clip you just showed. You know, just because you've been around for a decade and we've got all these economic challenges doesn't mean that your budgets have been any good. And, you know, the fact that I think he makes our point is that, you know, we've had 10 years of wages stagnating, we've got an aged care system in crisis, we've got skills mismatch across the country. You know, so what has he been doing?
Right. But there's a fair bit about this budget that you do like because you're voting for it en masse.
Well, we're certainly voting for the cost of living pressures, which need to be dealt with today because the Parliament rises and won't be back until after the election. So we are pretty keen to make sure that all those households under, you know, families under pressure from rising costs and flatlining wages are getting some assistance. But we will take our time to go through the rest of the budget to make sure that the expenditure is doing what it needs to do, and if there's areas to make, you know, sensible savings, we'll be looking to do that as well as any responsible opposition would do.
Yeah, well, a responsible government would do that too, and you'd be working with Jim Chalmers in 6 months if in fact you were the government. So where does your pen fall as you try to cut that spending in 6 months' time?
Well, we're doing some work from opposition on that. We think there are some areas where we can make sensible reductions in expenditure. Again, that's a responsible thing to do, and we will bring that responsible attitude into how we manage the budget if we were fortunate enough to win. But there's obviously a lot of work to do coming into government and being able to appraise the books and see them. But
there's a lot we know, and there's more we will know when we get the mid-election update
PIFO,
that comes from the Treasury. Simon Birmingham is trying to muddy the waters and suggests that the already legislated personal income tax cuts under a Labor government might be revisited. Can you rule that one out?
Well, that's just not true, and Simon would know that. I expect a bit better of him. We work closely together in the Senate. We've made it clear that, you know, whoever wins the election, the position on tax and income tax are the same. We've also made it clear that in terms of you know, looking at areas like multinational tax, that is where we will focus our effort. We are not taking the same agenda as we took to 2019, which I think the government, you know, is trying to muddy about, but we've been very clear about that in the decisions we've taken over the last couple of years.
And yet you would still face the same structural problem that the coalition is facing, and that is no matter how far you look out, 10 years is the horizon, there remains a persistent gap between what's being raised and what's being spent. They say they've got a strategy to close that, and this budget demonstrates it. What's yours?
Well, I'm not sure that the budget demonstrates that.
That's
you only have to, well, you only have to look at the graph to see that, you know, you've got a big gap between expenditure and revenue over the medium term. You know, the government that wins, or the party that wins the election, is going to inherit a pretty average set of books in terms of
deficits,
high levels of debt, deficits for as far as the eye can see. So the challenge then comes, what do you do about sensible investments? How do you make those investments to grow the economy, which helps improve the budget situation, but also deliver an economic dividend and hopefully an outcome for people? So they're the sort of structures that we're putting around our thinking when we're designing our policy. We want to be very clear about that, a very responsible approach to how to manage a budget. I've done it in the past. I don't know if Mr Morrison wants to have a crack at me.
You're not on his ledger. No, you're not on his ledger.
He can have a crack at me, but I've done it. I understand how you put a budget together. I understand how many times you have to say no to all the good ideas, and I understand where urgent pressures come from. And you know, that is something that any government has to manage day by day.
You've got to be flexible in the moment. But noting what you just said, can you give us an assurance that whatever steps you would take to address the structural deficit, we will know about before we go to the ballot box?
Well, we'll certainly be very clear about the costs of our policies and areas where we think we can reprioritise or reduce some expenditure. You will have that before the election. And you will
adopt a position that says no more, no less. These are the only actions we would take to address these issues that we're discussing, and we spelt each and every one of them out beforehand.
Well, I mean, in a sense, I've answered that. We will, with our policy. You'll see our policies that we intend to take the election. They'll all be costed. You'll see the cost of them. You'll see the impact once we get PIFO. You'll also see areas where we think we can make sensible savings. But we also have to acknowledge that when you are in government, you do need to deal with challenges. We haven't had access to the books. You know, we don't know the state of what all the time bombs that have been hidden in the budget, and we expect there are a lot. Like yesterday, for example, in the lockup, there is a lot of one-year funding of things.
What's wrong with that?
Well, more so than normal. So adult dental program, for example. I expect there will still need to be an adult dental program in the out years of the budget, but it's not funded. So we need to work through the detail of that carefully. And my reading of the budget papers was there was a lot more one-year funding for programs that would normally have an ongoing impact in the budget than I've seen before.
Implanted as ticking bombs for you guys, is that the accusation, or
well,
just
perhaps.
because they don't need to, in their own minds, plan beyond 12 months for whatever reason?
Well, we'll go through it in estimates, I think, because we do need to understand it. But sure, I think, you know, there's a different way that they've budgeted this year with some programs, and it might be that they are hedging their bets about what happens after the election.
Yep.
But we need to pursue that because, again, that's not responsible budgeting, and we need responsible budgeting if we are to get this budget back on track.
Yep, and just quickly and finally, because I'm getting hurried up, do you have a full week of estimates next week?
Well, it looks like it. It looks like it. We're planning for it.
All right.
Some may say unfortunately.
Well, some might, yes. That's a task that may or may not confront you. Let's wait and see, Katy Gallagher, what Scott Morrison does with the calling of the election. All right, coming up, we'll have more budget wash-up shortly. But first, let's get the latest on the heavy rain that revisited northern New South Wales. In Byron Bay, thankfully, floodwaters are already starting to recede after inundating the CBD there. More than 300 millimetres of rain fell across the Byron district overnight last night. Locals say it's the worst flash flooding that they can remember. Our reporter, Cayman Gock, is there.
Well, this is the state of Byron Bay CBD right now. Water is still lapping at some businesses' doors. You can see business owners have been able to access their stores for the first time, but the water has receded considerably. It is now around ankle deep height. Earlier today it reached waist to knee deep height. That's because of the enormous deluge that hit this town overnight. Nearly 300 millimetres of rain came crashing down overnight around a 12-hour period, and just the sheer amount of water meant that the drainage systems, which have already been sodden from weeks of rain, couldn't keep up. It's meant that businesses that managed to avoid being impacted by floodwaters a month ago, this time round weren't so lucky. So Byron Bay is now also impacted by this torrential and torrid weather. It also means that all these businesses, after more than 2 years of COVID restrictions, now have to deal with flood damage. After this is such a tourist town, heavily relying on people to come and visit as part of its economy, and now this is just another kick in the guts because the cleanup will take weeks from now.
Now, stunted wages are something that all workers have been living with for years, and because the economy is now bouncing back so strongly, the clamour for pay increases is growing ever louder. The budget doesn't directly deal with wages, but they're an important part of the economic settings that sit in behind the budget. So to discuss that, ACTU President Michele O'Neill joins us now. Michele, welcome back to Afternoon Briefing. Would it be a fair observation on your reading of the budget books that if inflation can actually be brought under control, the actual drivers of potential wage growth increases are starting to emerge? I mean, there is wage growth there. It's just that it's being overrun a bit by inflation in the near term.
Well, there's a few things, Greg, that I think are no longer truths when you look at the connections between things like the level of unemployment as well as what's happening in the economy and wage growth. And many of these nexuses have been broken, and what I mean by that is that you used to be the case if unemployment was going low, you would see wages going high. That no longer is true, and one of the reasons it's not true is because we have so many jobs now that are insecure: casual, contract, labour hire, gig economy jobs. So the bargaining power of workers is very different to what it was in the past. But I also think that we see in this budget projections that, like we've seen in the last 12 months, real wages going down. So workers lost $800 on average last year. They're going to lose another $500 in the first 6 months of this year. And I'm not very confident about the government's projections, and I'm not confident about them because they've got them wrong every single time. Like, they have not delivered one budget that has been correct in terms of wage growth. Yeah. And you understand the scepticism.
Well, yeah, sure, I understand that. So what would be the response then of the union movement? You're not going to sit around patiently forever waiting for these magic moments to click in to gear because, as you say, the rules have kind of been ripped up by recent economic standards. What is the solution going to be from your end?
Well, first of all, I want to say that there were numerous things that the government could have delivered in the budget that would have made a real difference in terms of lifting wages that they failed to do. So one of those is that they are one of the largest employers in the country, and if they want to support real wage growth for working people, they could have given public sector employees a wage increase, removed that public sector pay cap and delivered real wage increases. Good for those workers.
Yeah, I was going to say, would that have any flow-on benefit then? for private sector?
I think it absolutely would be the government leading by example. It would set a standard that would have an impact in terms of the private sector. They failed to do that completely. Secondly, they, of course, this week have an opportunity. This week, it's the National Wage Review, and the government could put in a submission into the National Wage case supporting a lift in wages for the lowest paid workers in the country. This is 1 in 4 Australian workers who are reliant on the decision of the National Wage case. And the government is missing in action again, not saying that what the workers need, their communities and the economy needs is a significant lift in the minimum wage.
Yeah, but do you think, Michele, that I note all that, but from action that you have, you know, at your disposal, is there any strategy afoot to agitate more forcefully, particularly for private sector workers, but not exclusively private sector workers?
Yeah, absolutely there is, Greg. You would see that, for example, on Thursday, nurses in New South Wales are going on strike again because they believe strongly that they're entitled to higher wages and that the government hasn't delivered on that. And so working people will join together and will say, we want fairer and better wages. And the best way to deliver that is through negotiation between unions and employers. But employers don't always want to do it by negotiation. And sometimes that results in people having to take action. And of course, workers are prepared to do that because it's so important. Yeah. And you can't, you know, the hardship that's involved with the cost of living going up like it is. We've seen childcare, for example, raise at 3 times the rate in terms of increases than wages just in the last few years, and rent even higher again.
No,
so
that much is
it's
clear.
Fair enough.
Yep, no, it's fair enough. All right, well, we'll await further developments on that front. We do have to leave our conversation there at that point for today, though. Michele O'Neill, thanks for joining us from
Thanks
the
very much, Greg.
ACTU. OK, now, right when Josh Frydenberg was spraying bundles of billions around last night, veteran Liberal Concetta Fierravanti-Wells was in the Senate spraying her leader. The 17-year senator for New South Wales offered a withering character assessment of the Prime Minister, this after being relegated by her party last weekend to an unwinnable position on the Liberal ticket for the May election.
In my public life, I have met ruthless people. Morrison tops the list. Morrison is not interested in the rules-based order. It is his way or the highway, an autocrat, a bully who has no moral compass. Morrison is not fit to be Prime Minister.
All right, so we might discuss that and, of course, the budget now at some length with our political panel joining me again in the studio. It's welcome, as we've been noting throughout this week, that we've got people back. Liberal LNP, National Senator, if you like, Susan McDonald, and Labor's Murray Watt. Both of you welcome back in person. Far easier to wage a conversation when we're this close together. Why don't we start, just because we heard from her very recently, Connie Fierravanti-Wells is obviously hurting. Susan, do you have any sympathy for her predicament right now?
Look, Senate pre-selections are very robust contests. I think it's an enormous privilege to end up in the Senate in Australia representing your state and your people. And so it is robust as it should be, but it's bruising. And I do have sympathy for her feelings and how she's feeling right now. I don't share her views. Right,
well, that was the follow-up. It's one thing to be bruised by these party processes. It's a competitive process. She came in at number 3. You would exercise restraint, would you, if you were in the same position, departing the Senate on the eve of an election?
I have been a member of my party for over 30 years, obviously joined as a child. But it means that I understand that I'm just carrying the torch for my cause until the next person comes. And I would hope that I will go with good grace and good humour. Let's see.
Dignified silence, says Susan Murray, but this actually, Connie Fierravanti-Wells' remarks actually feed into the Labor narrative very precisely, don't they?
And I think what's different about this, Greg, is that this is really just the latest in a series of comments that Liberal and National Party members have been making about Scott Morrison and the way he treats people for quite a long time. And really, if this is what the people who are closest to Scott Morrison say about him, if they don't trust him, then it's hard to understand how Australians can trust him. You know, Barnaby Joyce, it wasn't that long ago that he was sending text messages calling Scott Morrison a liar and a hypocrite. We've seen a range of other Liberal and National Party members really call into question Scott Morrison's character. And I think that's something that the Australian people are really going to evaluate at this election.
Is that front and centre for Labor's campaign now? I ask in the context of the budget, which we're about to discuss, but you're in lockstep with the government on almost every initiative that's needing to be legislated. That leaves then Scott Morrison as issue number one, does it?
I think the Prime Minister's character and whether people can trust him will be a central issue at this election, because I think, and that's a significant change from the last election when he was a blank slate. He was a new Prime Minister. People didn't really know what they were getting, but over the last 3 years, I think people have realised that Scott Morrison, for all of his promises, doesn't deliver. You know, full of announcements, and we saw it again last night, that we just know won't be delivered if his past form is any guide. He misleads people, he lets people down, and he goes missing in a crisis. And I think we've seen it over and over again, and I think we'll be certainly putting that to the people.
And so to your side, Susan, do people know what they're getting in Anthony Albanese? That's, I mean, we're already seeing the Prime Minister prosecuting that argument. How much will that be
I have to
pushed?
say, I think the views on the Prime Minister are incredibly unfair. This is a tough job. You don't go in to be Prime Minister to be a leader, to make tough decisions, and to make tough calls. And so I think that the Prime Minister has been a strong leader. He's been very clear. I think the opposition leader, you know, I've been wildly disappointed that he didn't call for an investigation into the treatment of Senator Kitching, as she asked and as has been raised by those members. I don't mean to make this a competition, but my point is that this is a very public arena, and I think if we extrapolate on some of these events, that would be very unfair and unwise.
And your side, Murray, will be, if you're not already, well aware that Scott Morrison is going to seek to make Anthony Albanese the issue. What gives you the confidence that he's not going to succeed there? Anthony Albanese isn't apparently fully known and appreciated by those outside politics as much as he is by those of us here.
No, that's right. But I think what people are coming to learn about Anthony Albanese is that he is a leader who shows up in a crisis, both literally and metaphorically. Just to take the Lismore floods recently, you know, Scott Morrison turned up into town after he'd finished his campaigning in Perth, hid from people in Lismore who wanted to talk with him about where they could live. In contrast, I spent the best part of 2 hours walking through the CBD of Lismore with Albo, who stopped many times to meet anyone who wanted to speak to him. And I think that goes to Albo's willingness to stand up in a crisis. And this is, I mean, it goes beyond what Scott Morrison might be like as a person. It goes to whether you've got a leader who takes responsibility, and whether it's vaccines or bushfires or floods or rats, over and over again, Scott Morrison just hasn't taken responsibility, and Albo is the kind of leader who will.
All right.
Well, again, though, the opposition leader did go to Western Australia while the Prime Minister had COVID. His electorate was still flooding. I mean, I think we've got to be careful not to politicise every action, particularly given that when the Prime Minister went to Lismore, I thought it was incredibly respectful not to televise every broken family and broken-hearted person who he spoke to. I thought it was respectful. I thought it was appropriate. And, you know, again...
Do you understand he was well received there in what were private... I mean, they were private exchanges. We have no way of knowing.
Yes. My understanding is that the local member, Kevin Hogan, has been through a trauma, as have all of those people. And for all of us who've been through flooded situations, this is really tough. And again, you know, let's not pick on one exchange or one conversation and extrapolate that to be the entire campaign.
All right, let's move on to the budget. You must be enormously influential, Susan, because you were one of the first people we became aware of who was asking for fuel excise relief, and it's been delivered at 22 cents in the litre. Is that what you wanted? Is it what you expected when you first started pushing this?
I am delighted because we live in a massive country, and particularly in regional areas, people drive you know, huge distances. They don't have public transport as an alternate option. The transport companies were really feeling it. Fuel levies are up to 18% on top of fuel and transport charges. And of course, it always ends up with either the consumer or the farmer who can't pass the costs on. So this reduction has been incredibly well received and welcomed. I'm also pleased, though, that there is a 6-month deadline on that.
Well, that's what I was going to ask. What gives you the confidence that everything will be right when it comes to cost of living pressures in 6 months?
Don't we wish we all had a crystal ball,
Yeah,
haven't we, for
but
the
it's
last
time
2
limited,
years?
so someone's decided in their wisdom, the treasurer or treasury, that this is a suitable window.
Yeah,
Do you reckon
New Zealand has chosen 3 months, other nations have chosen 4 and 5 months, Australia has chosen a more generous period at 6 months. We are seeing some indications that the oil price is falling slightly, but I think that's an appropriate time to set. And then we can review it at that point.
And you'd be happy with that? I mean, that's what the legislation says, Murray, that it expires in 6 months' time, so we can all expect fuel to go up by 22 cents a litre. No qualms about that? Or would it, should it, could it be reviewed at closer to the 6-month mark?
Well, we obviously welcome the fact that the Prime Minister has finally acknowledged that Australian families are under huge cost of living pressures. I suppose I just question why it was that we had to wait until a few weeks before an election before the Prime Minister finally realised what everyone in Australia is talking about. I mean, we're legislating now this excise reduction. We've had other sittings of Parliament this week this year where it could have been done, but of course he's waited till the last minute before an election before acting. So, you know, clearly it's not going to be possible, whoever wins the next election, to keep that excise cut permanently. We want to run a budget in a responsible manner, but it was really important that this budget delivered some cost of living relief, and all I can say is it's long overdue.
All right, just one quick one finally. I know being senators you might have other responsibilities tomorrow, but Volodymyr Zelensky is due to address the Parliament. Will you be trying to attend or take note of it in some ways?
Yeah, absolutely. Australians hate bullies. And the Ukrainian people, we have lots of connections with that country. I'm really proud of the visa arrangements for women and children to come to Australia. And absolutely, I'll be trying to watch his address.
Yep. Is that a yes from you too, Murray?
I'll certainly try, but I suspect I might be giving a minister a bit of a hard time in estimates, Greg, so holding people to account.
There is a bit of that going on.
But can I say, it's obviously a really important occasion, and Labor very much welcomes the address to the Parliament by President Zelensky.
Yeah, very well said. All right, well, look, Susan McDonald and Murray Watt, we'll wrap it up there. Bit squeezed today because it's budget week after all. So to round out our budget coverage, we have tried to cover the political field from a few different perspectives. The votes of the Greens haven't counted for much this year on the budget, but they could if the next Parliament is hung. So with that in mind, we spoke to their leader, Adam Bandt, a little earlier. Adam Bandt, thanks for coming back on the program today. Now, the Greens vote doesn't look like it will count for much when the budget bills are pushed through, as they will, between the Coalition and Labor. Why don't we break down then whether you are, in fact, prepared to vote against key measures? Fuel excise cut in half. The Greens' position on that?
Well, you're right. There are a lot of the terrible measures in this budget do have Labor's support, so they're likely to sail through Parliament, and we'll go through some of those in a moment. But on the question of cutting fuel tax, this is a cut that may never materialise in people's pockets, because the cut to excise could be completely overdone by a rise in the price of petrol if there's another world event, or if the big oil corporations decide not to pass it on. So it's a very short-term fix, and it is ultimately potentially not even going to reach people's pockets. If you wanted to tackle cost of living, there's some much better things to do than doing this and the stage 3 tax cuts, like wiping student debt, for example, would have a much bigger impact, building affordable housing. But there's our big concern about that particular measure, cutting fuel taxes, and voters may not ever even see it.
And any fears about whether it is, in fact, removed or put back up to the full 44 cents? There is a history of these things not being lifted when they're meant to.
Well, profiteering and international events are probably going to have more impact, and the climate crisis, on petrol prices than any short-term cut. And so in 6 months' time, you're right, we're going to be in a position where unless we get people over onto electric vehicles and unless we start introducing some real cost of living reforms, people may feel the pinch again, but we're kind of paying the price for Scott Morrison's electric vehicle denialism.
Sure, and I hear you making a point about the cash splash elements of the budget, the low to middle income tax offset and the $250 for pensioners and concession card holders. You say there are other ways to help cost of living, but on their merits as they stand, support or not support from the Greens?
Support those, but the budget is fundamentally unfair. Like we're facing a climate crisis, a housing crisis and an inequality crisis. But this budget has about over $37 billion for coal and gas, but renewables get cut by 35%. Climate spending gets cut by 35%, and there's about $1 billion in there for renewables. It locks in tax cuts for the wealthy, and so yes, low-income earners will get a one-off payment of $420, but billionaires get a $9,000 a year tax cut forever, like locked in forever. And there's $13 billion to push up housing prices, but no new money for affordable housing. So some of those measures by themselves, yes, we're going to support, but for many people, they'll be welcome, but they'll be here today, gone tomorrow, whereas the support for the top end, the top 1%, are going to continue and continue and continue with Labor's support.
Right, now if we did end up with a Labor government, we'd be having another budget inside about 6 months from now. If influential, if you, for instance, had a balance of power position in the lower house, what would be priority number one as a bargaining chip with them?
Well, there's a lot of bad things to undo in this budget. One is we've got to stop funding coal and gas. Like we are seeing water's now literally rising around Byron Bay shops and homes. Lismore's under evacuation again. Coal and gas are fuelling these floods. We should not be using public money to fund more coal and gas.
You're talking about infrastructure spends there, which are around ports.
We're talking about big handouts to the coal and gas corporations, but this budget has $300 million to go and help open up and frack the Beetaloo. That's a big gas climate bomb there. It's worse than Adani. Everyone knows Adani was bad. This is worse than Adani. It contains countries' worth of pollution locked up in the Northern Territory. And the government is saying, let's use public money that could be going to schools and hospitals to actually open it up. Like we shouldn't. We need to leave that in the ground. So that we need to, the stage 3 unfair tax cuts rip $184 billion out of the budget. The top 10% get the same as the bottom 60% combined. That's unfair. That's got to be reversed.
There's no reason to think Labor would willingly go there. I mean, that would represent a fundamental U-turn, a loss of faith, really.
It's the end of Australia's progressive tax system if those measures are kept. It means someone on minimum wage ends up paying the same tax rate as a CEO. Now, that is wrong. $184 billion is a massive hit to the budget. Instead, for cost of living measures, you ask what we would push, we'd say as well as not spending money on coal and gas, better cost of living measures than proceeding with stage 3 tax cuts would be to wipe student debt and build affordable housing.
Cost on the student debt?
Cost on the student debt is about $64 billion, about a third of the stage 3 tax cuts. The cost to build 1 million affordable homes over the next decade is about $21 billion. So instead of proceeding with stage 3 tax cuts, you could wipe student debt, build 1 million affordable homes that people can buy for $300,000 or rent for 25% of their income and still have change left over.
And would you means test? I know you're not going to be the Treasurer of Australia, but would you means test any of those spends if you got in a position to negotiate?
Well, wiping student debt, that should apply across the board. Everyone who's got student debt, that should be forgiven. That would be a huge cost.
Is that fair?
Cost
You're going to walk out of the university gates into a 6-figure salary?
Well, then you pay it back through the progressive tax system, and that's our point about stage 3 tax cuts as well. Let's have free education and have people who are earning 6 figures or 7-figure salary pay a higher rate of tax. In our mind, that is a fair approach, a higher rate than someone on a low income is what I mean, rather than necessarily a higher rate now. So those measures would address cost of living pressures while tackling the climate crisis, whereas these one-off sugar hits are here today, gone tomorrow.
Adam Bandt, thanks for joining us once again on Afternoon Briefing.
Thanks very much for having me.
Right, just before we wrap up for today, we might check in on Shane Warne's State Memorial service, which is getting underway tonight with tens of thousands of fans expected to fill the MCG to celebrate the life of this cricketing legend. And our reporter Tom Maddox is there. Tom, seeing a few people milling around you, how are the preparations looking?
Greg, the number of fans and attendees is just starting to outweigh the rather large media contingent which is stationed outside Gate 2 here at the MCG, here to cover tonight's event. But the gates are officially opening to the public shortly, and as you say, tens of thousands of people are expected to turn up tonight. 50,000 tickets had been made available for free. A further 10,000 were made available yesterday. And of course, such is the impact of Shane Warne, this event will be not only attended in person, seen across the country, but of course seen across the globe in countries where Shane Warne had a big impact, India and Sri Lanka, for example. Right,
yes, he is a name, a sporting name that transcends, our borders, as you say, particularly the Indian subcontinent. How is that going to be reflected in the plans for the service there?
Well, we'll have some cricketing greats locally here, guys like Mark Taylor, Alan Border, Michael Clark, for example, but we'll also have some overseas cricketing luminaries who are attending tonight's service, like Brian Lara and Nasser Hussain, for example. Sachin Tendulkar will be watching in also. So he, of course, had a massive impact overseas. But tonight there'll be a few special things, one of which will be the unveiling of the Shane Warne stand in honour of the man. And his family, his son Jackson Warne, spoke to the significance of having the event here at the MCG and the significance of having a stand named in honour of his father.
For a lot of us, especially our family, it's a great honour to have it at the MCG. He's done a lot of great things here. It's where he got his 700th wicket. He's made a lot of Victorians, Melburnians and Australians proud here on the very ground we're standing on. And he's got a statue out the front, and to have a grandstand named after him now is just unbelievable, as sad as it is. But for all of us to come and sit down at this ground for the rest of our lives and be able to say we're sitting in Dad's stand forever is pretty special, and I couldn't think of a better place around the world to have a send-off for him, because this is what he deserves.
Jackson Warne there, the son of Shane Warne, and of course he'll be speaking tonight, and so too Shane Warne's daughters in Summer and Brooke, so we'll have some tributes from the family. And of course Shane Warne was a lot about entertainment too, so there'll be some showbiz tonight, Anthony Collier, John Stevens, and there'll be pre-recorded tributes from musical heavyweights such as Elton John and Robbie Williams.
Yeah, heavily watched and covered, Tom Maddox. And what's this I hear about your own tribute? Something to do with a pair of socks you're wearing. Please enlighten us before we let you go.
Well, Shane Warne, of course, had a great association with the St Kilda Football Club. He was a big fan. I too, for my sins, are a big fan of the St Kilda Football Club. I've got some socks from the Saints just as my own little tribute, but they are inviting fans to wear cricket gear to tonight's memorial, so we are seeing some people come through in cricket gear. So it should be a colourful evening, Greg.
Very fitting, Tom Maddox, that you're covering it and covering it enthusiastically and empathetically too. And a reminder, you can watch the Shane Warne Memorial service live from the MCG this evening. Our coverage begins at 6:30 p.m. That's Eastern Daylight Saving Time here on the ABC News Channel and on iView. Now, that's it from the afternoon briefing team for today. As we noted right off the top of our program, the Parliament is beavering away on passing the budget into law. Progress is being made. It should even be completed by tonight. So further updates on that, and goodness knows what we'll be talking about tomorrow. Once all that presses through, this Parliament will almost be over. But we're back at 4 o'clock tomorrow. Join us then and stay with the News Channel for more updates shortly.